Chapter 16 of The Lost Prince. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Susan Umpleby. The Lost Prince by Frances Hodgson Burnett. Chapter 16. The Rat to the Rescue. Marco walked through the passage and into the kitchen part of the basement. The doors were all locked, and they were solid doors. He ran up the flagged steps and found the door at the top shut and bolted also, and that too was a solid door. His jailers had plainly made sure that it should take time enough for him to make his way into the world, even after he got out of the wine cellar. The cat had run away to some part of the place where mice were plentiful. Marco was by this time rather gnawingly hungry himself. If he could get into the kitchen, he might find some fragments of food left in a cupboard, but there was no moving the locked door. He tried the outlet into the area, but that was immovable. Then he saw near it a smaller door. It was evidently the entrance to the coal cellar under the pavement. This was proved by the fact that trodden coal dust marked the flagstones, and near it stood a scuttle with coal in it. This coal scuttle was the thing which might help him. Above the area door was a small window which was supposed to light the entry. He could not reach it, and if he reached it, he could not open it. He could throw pieces of coal at the glass and break it, and then he could shout for help when people passed by. They might not notice or understand where the shouts came from at first, but if he kept them up, someone's attention would be attracted in the end. He picked a large-sized solid piece of coal out of the heap in the scuttle, and threw it with all his force against the grimy glass. It smashed through and left a big hole. He threw another, and the entire pane was splintered and fell outside into the area. Then he saw it was broad daylight, and guessed that he had been shut up a good many hours. There was plenty of coal in the scuttle, and he had a strong arm and a good aim. He smashed pane after pane until only the framework remained. When he shouted, there would be nothing between his voice and the street. No one could see him, but if he could do something which would make people slacken their pace to listen, then he could call out that he was in the basement of the house with a broken window. "Hello!" he shouted. "Hello! Hello! Hello! Hello!" But vehicles were passing in the street, and the passers-by were absorbed in their own business. If they heard a sound, they did not stop to inquire into it. "Hello! Hello! I am locked in!" yelled Marco at the topmost power of his lungs. "Hello! Hello!" After half an hour's shouting, he began to think he was wasting his strength. "They only think it is a boy shouting," he said. "Someone will notice in time. At night, when the streets are quiet, I might make a policeman hear. But my father does not know where I am. He will be trying to find me. So will Lazarus, so will the rat. One of them might pass through this very street, as I did. What can I do?" A new idea flashed light upon him. "I will begin to sing a Samavian song, and I will sing it very loud. People nearly always stop a moment to listen to music and find out where it comes from. And if any one of my own people came near, they would stop at once, and now and then I will shout for help." Once when they had stopped to rest on Hampstead Heath, he had sung a valiant Samavian song for the rat. The rat had wanted to hear how he would sing when they went on their secret journey. He wanted him to sing for the Squad some day, to make the thing seem real. The rat had been greatly excited and had begged for the song often. It was a stirring, martial thing, with a sort of trumpet call of a chorus. Thousands of Samavians had sung it together on their way to the battlefield hundreds of years ago. He drew back a step or so, and, putting his hands on his hips, began to sing, throwing his voice upward that it might pass through the broken window. He had a splendid and vibrant young voice, though he knew nothing of its fine quality. Just now, he wanted only to make it loud. In the street outside, very few people were passing. An irritable old gentleman who was taking an invalid walk quite jumped with annoyance when the song suddenly trumpeted forth. Boys had no right to yell in that manner. He hurried his step to get away from the sound. 2 or 3 other people glanced over their shoulders, but none had time to loiter. A few others listened with pleasure as they drew near and passed on. "There's a boy with a fine voice," said one. "What's he singing?" said his companion. "It sounds foreign." "Don't know," was the reply as they went by. But at last, a young man who was a music teacher going to give a lesson, hesitated and looked about him. The song was very loud and spirited just at this moment. The music teacher could not understand where it came from, and paused to find out. The fact that he stopped attracted the attention of the next comer, who also paused. "Who's singing?" he asked. "Where is he singing?" "I can't make it out," the music teacher laughed. "Sounds as if it came out of the ground." And because it was queer that a sound should seem to be coming out of the ground, a costermonger stopped, and then a little boy, and then a working woman, and then a lady. There was quite a little group when another person turned the corner of the street. He was a shabby boy on crutches, and he had a frantic look on his face. And Marco actually heard, as he drew near to the group, the tap, tap, tap of crutches. It might be, he thought. It might be! And he sang the trumpet call of the chorus, as if it were meant to reach the skies, and he sang it again and again, and at the end of it shouted, "Hallo! Hallo! 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 Hallo!" The Rat swung himself into the group and looked as if he had gone crazy. He hurled himself against the people. "Where is he? Where is he?" he cried, and he poured out some breathless words. It was almost as if he sobbed them out. "We've been looking for him all night!" he shouted. "Where is he? Marco! Marco! No one else sings it but him. Marco! Marco!" And out of the area, as it seemed, came a shout of an answer. "Rat! Rat! I'm here in the cellar, locked in! I'm here!" And a big piece of coal came hurtling through the broken window and fell crashing on the area flags. The Rat got down the steps into the area as if he had not been on crutches but on legs, and banged on the door, shouting back, "Marco! Marco! Here I am! Who locked you in? How can I get the door open?" Marco was close against the door inside. It was the Rat! It was the Rat! And he would be in the street again in a few minutes. "Call a policeman!" he shouted through the keyhole. "The people locked me in on purpose and took away the keys." Then the group of lookers-on began to get excited and press against the area railings and ask questions. They could not understand what had happened to cause the boy with the crutches to look as if he were crazy with terror and relief at the same time. And the little boy ran delightedly to fetch a policeman, and found one in the next street, and, with some difficulty, persuaded him that it was his business to come and get a door open in an empty house, where a boy who was a street singer had got locked up in a cellar. End of chapter 16. Chapter 17 of The Lost Prince. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Susan Umpleby. The Lost Prince by Frances Hodgson Burnett. Chapter 17. It is a very bad sign. The policeman was not so much excited as out of temper. He did not know what Marco knew, or what The Rat knew. Some common lad had got himself locked up in a house, and someone would have to go to the landlord and get a key from him. He had no intention of laying himself open to the law by breaking into a private house with his truncheon as The Rat expected him to do. "He got himself in through some of his larks, and he'll have to wait till he's got out without smashing locks," he growled, shaking the area door. "How did you get in there?" he shouted. It was not easy for Marco to explain through a keyhole that he had come in to help a lady who had met with an accident. The policeman thought this mere boy's talk. As to the rest of the story, Marco knew that it could not be related at all without saying things which could not be explained to anyone but his father. He quickly made up his mind that he must let it be believed that he had been locked in by some queer accident. It must be supposed that the people had not remembered in their haste that he had not yet left the house. When the young clerk from the house agency came with the keys, he was much disturbed and bewildered after he got inside. "They've made a bolt of it," he said. "That happens now and then, but there's something queer about this. What did they lock those doors in the basement for, and the one on the stairs?" "What did they say to you?" he asked Marco, staring at him suspiciously. "They said they were obliged to go suddenly," Marco answered. "What were you doing in the basement?" "The man took me down." "And left you there and bolted? He must have been in a hurry." "The lady said they had not a moment's time." "Her ankle must have got well in short order," said the young man. "I knew nothing about them," answered Marco. "I had never seen them before." "The police were after them," the young man said. "That's what I should say. They paid 3 months' rent in advance, and they have only been here 2. Some of these foreign spies lurking about London, that's what they were." The Rat had not waited until the keys arrived. He had swung himself at his swiftest pace back through the streets to number 7 Philibert Place. People turned and stared at his wild, pale face as he almost shot past them. He had left himself barely breath enough to speak with when he reached the house and banged on the door with his crutch to save time. Both Loristan and Lazarus came to answer. The Rat leaned against the door, gasping. "He's found! He's all right!" he panted. "Someone had him locked in a house and left him. They've sent for the keys. I'm going back. Brandon Terrace, number 10. Loristan and Lazarus exchanged glances. Both of them were at the moment as pale as the Rat. "Help him into the house," said Loristan to Lazarus. "He must stay here and rest. We will go." The Rat knew it was an order. He did not like it, but he obeyed. "This is a bad sign, Master," said Lazarus as they went out together. "It is a very bad one," answered Loristan. "God of the right defend us," Lazarus groaned. "Amen," said Loristan. "Amen." The group had become a small crowd by the time they reached Brandon Terrace. Marco had not found it easy to leave the place because he was being questioned. Neither the policeman nor the agent's clerk seemed willing to relinquish the idea that he could give them some information about the absconding pair. The entrance of Loristan produced its usual effect. The agent's clerk lifted his hat, and the policeman stood straight and made salute. Neither of them realized that the tall man's clothes were worn and threadbare. They felt only that a personage was before them, and that it was not possible to question his air of absolute and serene authority. He laid his hand on Marco's shoulder and held it there as he spoke. When Marco looked up at him and felt the closeness of his touch, it seemed as if it were an embrace, as if he had caught him to his breast. "My boy knew nothing of these people," he said. "That I can guarantee. He had seen neither of them before. His entering the house was the result of no boyish trick. He has been shut up in this place for nearly 24 hours and has had no food. I must take him home. This is my address." He handed the young man a card. Then they went home together, and all the way to Philibert Place, Loristan's firm hand held closely to his boy's shoulder, as if he could not endure to let him go. But on the way they said very little. "Father," Marco said rather hoarsely when they first got away from the house on the terrace, "I can't talk well in the street. For one thing, I am so glad to be with you again. It seemed as if it might turn out badly." "Beloved one," Loristan said the words in their own Samavian, "until you are fed and at rest, you shall not talk at all." Afterward, when he was himself again and was allowed to tell his strange story, Marco found that both his father and Lazarus had at once had suspicions when he had not returned. They knew no ordinary event could have kept him. They were sure that he must have been detained against his will, and they were also sure that, if he had been so detained, it could only have been for reasons they could guess at. "This was the card she gave me," Marco said, and he handed it to Loristan. "She said you would remember the name." Loristan looked at the lettering with an ironic half smile. "I never heard it before," he replied. "She would not send me a name I knew. Probably I have never seen either of them. But I know the work they do. They are spies of the Maranovitch, and suspect that I know something of the Lost Prince. They believed they could terrify you into saying things which would be a clue. Men and women of their class will use desperate means to gain their end." "Might they have left me as they threatened?" Marco asked him. "They would scarcely have dared, I think. Too great a hue and cry would have been raised by the discovery of such a crime. Too many detectives would have been set at work to track them." But the look in his father's eyes as he spoke, and the pressure of the hand he stretched out to touch him, made Marco's heart thrill. He had won a new love and trust from his father. When they sat together and talked that night, they were closer to each other's souls than they had ever been before. They sat in the firelight, Marco upon the worn hearthrug, and they talked about Samavia, about the war and its heartrending struggles, and about how they might end. "Do you think that sometime we might be exiles no longer?" the boy asked wistfully. "Do you think we might go there together and see it, you and I, Father?" There was a silence for a while. Loristan looked into the sinking bed of red coal. For years I have made for my soul that image," he said slowly. "When I think of my friend on the side of the Himalayan mountains, I say, 'The thought which thought the world may give us that also.'" End of chapter 17. Chapter 18 of The Lost Prince. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Susan Umpleby. The Lost Prince by Frances Hodgson Burnett. Chapter 18. Cities and Faces. The hours of Marco's unexplained absence had been terrible to Loristan and to Lazarus. They had reason for fears which it was not possible for them to express. As the night drew on, the fears took stronger form. They forgot the existence of The Rat, who sat biting his nails in the bedroom, afraid to go out lest he might lose the chance of being given some errand to do, but also afraid to show himself lest he should seem to be in the way. "I'll stay upstairs," he had said to Lazarus. "If you just whistle, I'll come." The anguish he passed through as the day went by and Lazarus went out and came in and he himself received no orders could not have been expressed in any ordinary words. He writhed in his chair. He bit his nails to the quick. He wrought himself into a frenzy of misery and terror by recalling one by one all the crimes his knowledge of London police courts supplied him with. He was doing nothing, yet he dare not leave his post. It was his post, after all, though they had not given it to him. He must do something. In the middle of the night, Loristan opened the door of the back sitting room, because he knew he must at least go upstairs and throw himself upon his bed, even if he could not sleep. He started back as the door opened. The Rat was sitting huddled on the floor near it with his back against the wall. He had a piece of paper in his hand, and his twisted face was a weird thing to see. "Why are you here?" Loristan asked. "I've been here 3 hours, sir. I knew you'd have to come out sometime, and I thought you'd let me speak to you. Will you? Will you?" "Come into the room," said Loristan. "I will listen to anything you want to say. What have you been drawing on that paper?" As the Rat got up in the wonderful way he had taught himself. The paper was covered with lines, which showed it to be another of his plans. "Please look at it," he begged. "I daren't go out lest you might want to send me somewhere. I daren't sit doing nothing. I began remembering and thinking things out. I put down all the streets and squares he might have walked through on his way home. I've not missed one. If you'll let me start out and walk through every one of them and talk to the policemen on the beat and look at the houses and think things out and work at them, I'll not miss an inch. I'll not miss a brick or a flagstone. I'll—" His voice had a hard sound, but it shook, and he himself shook. Loristan touched his arm gently. "You are a good comrade," he said. "It is well for us that you are here. You have thought of a good thing." "May I go now?" said the Rat. "This moment, if you are ready," was the answer. The Rat swung himself to the door. Loristan said to him a thing which was like a sudden lighting of a great light in the very center of his being. "You are one of us. Now that I know you are doing this, I may even sleep. You are one of us." And it was because he was following this plan that the Rat had turned into Brandon Terrace and heard the Samavian song ringing out from the locked basement of number 10. "Yes, he is one of us," Loristan said, when he told this part of the story to Marco as they sat by the fire. "I had not been sure before. I wanted to be very sure. Last night I saw into the depths of him and knew. He may be trusted." From that day the Rat held a new place. Lazarus himself, strangely enough, did not resent his holding it. The boy was allowed to be near Loristan as he had never dared to hope to be near. It was not merely that he was allowed to serve him in many ways, but he was taken into the intimacy which had before enclosed only the three. Loristan talked to him as he talked to Marco, drawing him within the circle which held so much that was comprehended without speech. The Rat knew he was being trained and observed, and he realized it with exultation. His idol had said he was one of them, and he was watching and putting him to tests so that he might find out how much he was one of them. And he was doing it for some grave reason of his own. This thought possessed the Rat's whole mind. Perhaps he was wondering if he should find out that he was to be trusted, as a rock is to be trusted. That he should even think that perhaps he might find that he was like a rock was inspiration enough. "Sir," he said one night when they were alone together because the Rat had been copying a road map. His voice was very low. "Do you think that, sometime, you could trust me as you trust Marco? Could it ever be like that? Ever?" "The time has come," and Loristan's voice was almost as low as his own, though strong and deep feeling underlay its quiet. "The time has come when I can trust you with Marco, to be his companion, to care for him, to stand by his side at any moment. And Marco is my son." That was enough to uplift the Rat to the skies, but there was more to follow. "It may not be long before it may be his part to do work in which he will need a comrade who can be trusted, as a rock can be trusted." He had said the very words the Rat's own mind had given him. "A rock! A rock!" the boy broke out. "Let me show you, sir. Send me with him for a servant. The crutches are nothing. You've seen that they're as good as legs, haven't you? I've trained myself." I know, dear lad." Marco had told him all of it. He gave him a gracious smile, which seemed as if it held a sort of fine secret. "You shall go as his aide de camp. It shall be part of the game." He had always encouraged the game, and during the last weeks had even found time to help them in their plannings for the mysterious journey of the secret two. He had been so interested that once or twice he had called on Lazarus as an old soldier and Samavian to give his opinions of certain routes, and of the customs and habits of people in towns and villages by the way. Here they would find simple pastoral folk who danced, sang after their day's work, and who would tell all they knew. Here they would find those who served or feared the Maranovitch and who would not talk at all. In one place they would meet with hospitality, in another with unfriendly suspicion of all strangers. Through talk and stories, The Rat began to know the country almost as Marco knew it. That was part of the game, too, because it was always the game, they called it. Another part was The Rat's training of his memory, and bringing home his proofs of advance at night when he returned from his walk, and could describe or recite or roughly sketch all he had seen in his passage from one place to another. Marco's part was to recall and sketch faces. Loristan one night gave him a number of photographs of people to commit to memory. Under each face was written the name of a place. "Learn these faces," he said, "until you would know each one of them at once wheresoever you met it. Fix them upon your mind so that it will be impossible for you to forget them. You must be able to sketch any one of them and recall the city or town or neighborhood connected with it." Even this was still called the game, but Marco began to know in his secret heart that it was so much more that his hands sometimes trembled with excitement as he made his sketches over and over again. To make each one many times was the best way to embed it in his memory. The Rat knew, too, though he had no reason for knowing but mere instinct. He used to lie awake in the night and think it over and remember what Loristan had said of the time coming when Marco might need a comrade in his work. What was his work to be? It was to be something like the game, and they were being prepared for it. And though Marco often lay awake on his bed when The Rat lay awake on his sofa, neither boy spoke to the other of the thing his mind dwelt on. And Marco worked as he had never worked before. The game was very exciting when he could prove his prowess. The four gathered together at night in the back sitting room. Lazarus was obliged to be with them because a second judge was needed. Loristan would mention the name of a place, perhaps a street in Paris or a hotel in Vienna, and Marco would at once make a rapid sketch of the face under whose photograph the name of the locality had been written. It was not long before he could begin his sketch without more than a moment's hesitation. And yet, even when this had become the case, they still played the game, night after night. There was a great hotel near the Place de la Concorde in Paris, of which Marco felt he should never hear the name during all his life without there starting up before his mental vision a tall woman with fierce black eyes and a delicate, high-bridged nose, across which the strong eyebrows almost met. In Vienna there was a palace which would always bring back at once a pale, cold-faced man with a heavy blonde lock which fell over his forehead. A certain street in Munich meant a stout, genial old aristocrat with a sly smile. A village in Bavaria, a peasant with a vacant and simple countenance. A curled and smoothed man who looked like a hairdresser brought up a place in an Austrian mountain town. He knew them all as he knew his own face and number 7 Philibert Place. But still, night after night, the game was played. Then came a night when, out of a deep sleep, he was awakened by Lazarus touching him. He had so long been secretly ready to answer any call that he sat up straight in bed at the first touch. "Dress quickly and come downstairs," Lazarus said. "The Prince is here and wishes to speak with you." Marco made no answer, but got out of bed and began to slip on his clothes. Lazarus touched the rat. The rat was as ready as Marco and sat upright as he had done. "Come down with the young master," he commanded. "It is necessary that you should be seen and spoken to." And having given the order, he went away. No one heard the shoeless feet of the two boys as they stole down the stairs. An elderly man in ordinary clothes, but with an unmistakable face, was sitting quietly talking to Loristan, who with a gesture called both forward. "The Prince has been much interested in what I have told him of your game," he said in his lowest voice. "He wishes to see you make your sketches, Marco." Marco looked very straight into the Prince's eyes, which were fixed intently on him as he made his bow. "His Highness does me honor," he said, as his father might have said it. He went to the table at once and took from a drawer his pencils and pieces of cardboard. "I should know he was your son and a Samavian," the Prince remarked. Then his keen and deep-set eyes turned themselves on the boy with the crutches. "This," said Loristan, "is the one who calls himself the Rat. He is one of us." The Rat saluted. "Please tell him, sir," he whispered, "that the crutches don't matter." "He has trained himself to an extraordinary activity," Loristan said. "He can do anything." The keen eyes were still taking the Rat in. "They are an advantage," said the Prince at last. Lazarus had nailed together a light, rough easel which Marco used in making his sketches when the game was played. Lazarus was standing in state at the door, and he came forward, brought the easel from its corner, and arranged the necessary drawing materials upon it. Marco stood near it and waited the pleasure of his father and his visitor. They were speaking together in low tones, and he waited several minutes. What the Rat noticed was what he had noticed before, that the big boy could stand still in perfect ease and silence. It was not necessary for him to say things or to ask questions, to look at people as if he felt restless if they did not speak to or notice him. He did not seem to require notice, and The Rat felt vaguely that, young as he was, this very freedom from any anxiety to be looked at or addressed made him somehow look like a great gentleman. Loristan and the Prince advanced to where he stood. "L'Hôtel des Marigny," Loristan said. Marco began to sketch rapidly. He began the portrait of the handsome woman with the delicate high-bridged nose and the black brows which almost met. As he did it, the Prince drew nearer and watched the work over his shoulder. It did not take very long, and, when it was finished, the inspector turned, and after giving Loristan a long and strange look, nodded twice. "It is a remarkable thing," he said. "In that rough sketch she is not to be mistaken." Loristan bent his head. Then he mentioned the name of another street in another place, and Marco sketched again. This time it was the peasant with the simple face. The Prince bowed again. Then Loristan gave another name, and after that another and another, and Marco did his work until it was at an end, and Lazarus stood near with a handful of sketches which he had silently taken charge of as each was laid aside. "You would know these faces wheresoever you saw them?" said the Prince. "If you passed one in Bond Street or in the Marylebone Road, you would recognize it at once?" "As I know yours, sir," Marco answered. Then followed a number of questions. Loristan asked them as he had often asked them before. They were questions as to the height and build of the originals of the pictures, and of the color of their hair and eyes, and the order of their complexions. Marco answered them all. He knew all but the names of these people, and it was plainly not necessary that he should know them, as his father had never uttered them. After this questioning was at an end, the Prince pointed to the Rat, who had leaned on his crutches against the wall, his eyes fiercely eager like a ferret's. "And he," the Prince said, "what can he do?" "Let me try," said the Rat. "Marco knows." Marco looked at his father. "May I help him to show you?" he asked. "Yes," Loristan answered. and then, as he turned to the Prince, he said again in his low voice, "He is one of us." Then Marco began a new form of the game. He held up one of the pictured faces before the Rat, and the Rat named at once the city and place connected with it. He detailed the color of eyes and hair, the height, the build, all the personal details as Marco himself had detailed them. To these he added descriptions of the cities and points concerning the police system, the palaces, the people. His face twisted itself, his eyes burned, his voice shook, but he was amazing in his readiness of reply and his exactness of memory. "I can't draw," he said at the end, "but I can remember. I didn't want any one to be bothered with thinking I was trying to learn it, so only Marco knew." This he said to Loristan with an appeal in his voice. "It was he who invented the game," said Loristan. "I showed you his strange maps and plans." "It is a good game," the Prince answered in the manner of a man extraordinarily interested and impressed. "They know it well. They can be trusted." "No such thing has ever been done before," Loristan said. "It is as new as it is daring and simple." "Therein lies its safety," the Prince answered. "Perhaps only boyhood," said Loristan, "could have dared to imagine it." "The Prince thanks you," he said after a few more words spoken aside to his visitor. "We both thank you. You may go back to your beds." And the boys went. End of chapter 18. Chapter 19 of The Lost Prince. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Susan Umpleby. The Lost Prince by Francis Hodgson Burnett. Chapter 19. That is one. A week had not passed before Marco brought to the Rat in their bedroom an envelope containing a number of slips of paper, on each of which was written something. "This is another part of the game," he said gravely. "Let us sit down together by the table and study it." They sat down and examined what was written on the slips. At the head of each was the name of one of the places with which Marco had connected a face he had sketched. Below were clear and concise directions as to how it was to be reached, and the words to be said when each individual was encountered. "This person is to be found at his stall in the market," was written of the vacant-faced peasant. "You will first attract his attention by asking the price of something. When he is looking at you, touch your left thumb lightly with the forefinger of your right hand. Then utter in a low, distinct tone the words, 'The lamp is lighted.' That is all you are to do." Sometimes the directions were not quite so simple, but they were all instructions of the same order. The originals of the sketches were to be sought out, always with precaution which should conceal that they were being sought at all, and always in such a manner as would cause an encounter to appear to be mere chance. Then certain words were to be uttered, but always without attracting the attention of any bystander or passer-by. The boys worked at their task through the entire day. They concentrated all their powers upon it. They wrote and rewrote. They repeated to each other what they committed to memory as if it were a lesson. Marco worked with the greater ease and more rapidly, because exercise of this order had been his practice and entertainment from his babyhood. The Rat, however, almost kept pace with him, as he had been born with a phenomenal memory, and his eagerness and desire were a fury. But throughout the entire day, neither of them once referred to what they were doing as anything but the game. At night, it is true, each found himself lying awake and thinking. It was the Rat who broke the silence from his sofa. "It is what the messengers of the secret party would be ordered to do when they were sent out to give the sign of the Rising," he said. "I made that up the first day I invented the party, didn't I?" "Yes," answered Marco. After a third day's concentration, they knew by heart everything given to them to learn. That night Loristan put them through an examination. "Can you write these things?" he asked, after each had repeated them and emerged safely from all cross-questioning. Each boy wrote them correctly from memory. "Write yours in French, in German, in Russian, in Samavian," Loristan said to Marco. "All you have told me to do and to learn is part of myself, Father," Marco said in the end. "It is part of me, as if it were my hand or my eyes or my heart." "I believe that is true," answered Loristan. He was pale that night, and there was a shadow on his face. His eyes held a great longing as they rested on Marco. It was a yearning which had a sort of dread in it. Lazarus also did not seem quite himself. He was red instead of pale, and his movements were uncertain and restless. He cleared his throat nervously at intervals, and more than once left his chair as if to look for something. It was almost midnight when Loristan, standing near Marco, put his arm round his shoulders. "The game," he began, and then was silent a few moments while Marco felt his arm tighten its hold. Both Marco and The Rat felt a hard, quick beat in their breasts, and because of this, and because the pause seemed long, Marco spoke. "The game. Yes, Father?" he said. "The game is about to give you work to do. Both of you," Loristan answered. Lazarus cleared his throat and walked to the easel in the corner of the room. But he only changed the position of a piece of drawing paper on it and then came back. "In 2 days you are to go to Paris, as you," to The Rat, "planned in the game." "As I planned?" The Rat barely breathed the words. "Yes," answered Loristan. "The instructions you have learned you will carry out. There is no more to be done than to manage to approach certain persons closely enough to be able to utter certain words to them." "Only 2 young strollers whom no man could suspect," put in Lazarus in an astonishingly rough and shaky voice. "They could pass near the Emperor himself without danger. The young master—" His voice became so hoarse that he was obligated to clear it loudly. "The young master must carry himself less finely. It would be well to shuffle a little and slouch as if he were of the common people." "Yes," said The Rat hastily. "He must do that. I can teach him. He holds his head and his shoulders like a gentleman. He must look like a street lad." "I will look like one," said Marco with determination. "I will trust you to remind him," Loristan said to The Rat, and he said it with gravity. "That will be your charge." As he lay upon his pillow that night, it seemed to Marco as if a load had lifted itself from his heart. It was the load of uncertainty and longing. He had so long borne the pain of feeling that he was too young to be allowed to serve in any way. His dreams had never been wild ones. They had, in fact, always been boyish and modest, howsoever romantic. But now no dream which could have passed through his brain would have seemed so wonderful as this, that the hour had come. The hour had come, and that he, Marco, was to be its messenger. He was to do no dramatic deed and be announced by no flourish of heralds. No one would know what he did. What he achieved could only be attained if he remained obscure and unknown and seemed to everyone only a common, ordinary boy who knew nothing whatever of important things. But his father had given to him a gift so splendid that he trembled with awe and joy as he thought of it. The game had become real. He and The Rat were to carry with them the Sign, and it would be like carrying a tiny lamp to set aflame lights which would blaze from one mountain top to another until half the world seemed on fire. As he had awakened out of his sleep when Lazarus touched him, so he awakened in the middle of the night again. But he was not aroused by a touch. When he opened his eyes, He knew it was a look which had penetrated his sleep, a look in the eyes of his father, who was standing by his side. In the road outside there was the utter silence he had noticed the night of the Prince's first visit. The only light was that of the lamp in the street, but he could see Loristan's face clearly enough to know that the mere intensity of his gaze had awakened him. The Rat was sleeping profoundly. Loristan spoke in Samavian and under his breath. "Beloved one," he said, "you are very young. Because I am your father, just at this hour I can feel nothing else. I have trained you for this through all the years of your life. I am proud of your young maturity and strength, but, beloved, you are a child. Can I do this thing?" For the moment his face and his voice were scarcely like his own. He kneeled by the bedside, and, as he did it, Marco, half sitting up, caught his hand and held it hard against his breast. "Father, I know!" he cried under his breath also. "It is true. I am a child. But am I not a man also? You yourself said it. I always knew that you were teaching me to be one, for some reason. It was my secret that I knew it. I learned well because I never forgot it. And I learned, did I not?" He was so eager that he looked more like a boy than ever, but his young strength and courage were splendid to see. Loristan knew him through and through and read every boyish thought of his. "Yes," he answered slowly. "You did your part. And now if I drew back, you would feel that I had failed you. Failed you." "You!" Marco breathed it proudly. "You could not fail even the weakest thing in the world." There was a moment's silence in which the two pairs of eyes dwelt on each other with the deepest meaning. And then Loristan rose to his feet. "The end will be all that our hearts most wish," he said. "Tomorrow you may begin the new part of the game. You may go to Paris." When the train which was to meet the boat that crossed from Dover to Calais steamed out of the noisy Charing Cross station, it carried in a third-class carriage two shabby boys. One of them would have been a handsome lad if he had not carried himself slouchingly and walked with a street lad's careless, shuffling gait. The other was a cripple who moved slowly, and apparently with difficulty, on crutches. There was nothing remarkable or picturesque enough about them to attract attention. They sat in the corner of the carriage, and neither talked much, nor seemed to be particularly interested in the journey or each other. When they went on board the steamer, they were soon lost among the commoner passengers, and in fact found for themselves a secluded place which was not advantageous enough to be wanted by any one else. "What can such a poor-looking pair of lads be going to Paris for?" some one asked his companion. "Not for pleasure, certainly. Perhaps to get work," was the casual answer. In the evening they reached Paris, and Marco led the way to a small café in a side street where they got some cheap food. In the same side street they found a bed they could share for the night in a tiny room over a baker's shop. The Rat was too much excited to be ready to go to bed early. He begged Marco to guide him about the brilliant streets. They went slowly along the broad Avenue des Champs-Élysées, under the lights glittering among the horse-chestnut trees. The Rat's sharp eyes took it all in: the light of the cafés among the embowering trees, the many carriages rolling by, the people who loitered and laughed or sat at little tables drinking wine and listening to music, the broad stream of life which flowed on to the Arc de Triomphe and back again. "It's brighter and clearer than London," he said to Marco. "The people look as if they are having more fun than they do in England." The Place de la Concorde, spreading its stately spaces, a world of illumination, movement, and majestic beauty, held him as though by a fascination. He wanted to stand and stare at it, first from one point of view and then from another. It was bigger and more wonderful than he had been able to picture it when Marco had described it to him and told him of the part it had played in the days of the French Revolution, when the guillotine had stood in it and the tumbrils had emptied themselves at the foot of its steps. He stood near the obelisk a long time without speaking. "I can see it all happening," he said at last, and he pulled Marco away. Before they returned home, they found their way to a large house which stood in a courtyard. In the ironwork of the handsome gates which shut it in was wrought a gilded coronet. The gates were closed and the house was not brightly lighted. They walked past it and round it without speaking, but when they neared the entrance for the second time, the Rat said in a low tone, "She is 5 feet 7, has black hair, a nose with a high bridge, her eyebrows are black and almost meet across it. She has a pale olive skin and holds her head proudly." "That is the one," Marco answered. They were a week in Paris, and each day passed this big house. There were certain hours when great ladies were more likely to go out and come in than they were at others. Marco knew this, and they managed to be within sight of the house or to pass it at these hours. For 2 days they saw no sign of the person they wished to see. But one morning the gates were thrown open and they saw flowers and palms being taken in. "She has been away and is coming back," said Marco. The next day they passed 3 times. Once at the hour when fashionable women drive out to do their shopping, once at the time when afternoon visiting is most likely to begin, and once when the streets were brilliant with lights and the carriages had begun to roll by to dinner parties and theaters. Then, as they stood a little distance from the iron gates, a carriage drove through them and stopped before the big open door which was thrown open by 2 tall footmen in splendid livery. "She is coming out," said The Rat. They would be able to see her plainly when she came, because the lights over the entrance were so bright. Marco slipped from under his coat sleeve a carefully made sketch. He looked at it, and The Rat looked at it. A footman stood erect on each side of the open door. The footman who sat with the coachman had got down and was waiting by the carriage. Marco and The Rat glanced again with furtive haste at the sketch. A handsome woman appeared upon the threshold. She paused and gave some order to the footman who stood on the right. Then she came out in the full light and got into the carriage which drove out of the courtyard and quite near the place where the 2 boys waited. When it was gone, Marco drew a long breath as he tore the sketch into very small pieces indeed. He did not throw them away, but put them into his pocket. The Rat drew a long breath also. "Yes," he said positively. "Yes," said Marco. When they were safely shut up in their room over the baker's shop, they discussed the chances of their being able to pass her in such a way as would seem accidental. 2 common boys could not enter the courtyard. There was a back entrance for tradespeople and messengers. When she drove, she would always enter her carriage from the same place. Unless she sometimes walked, they could not approach her. What should be done? The thing was difficult. After they had talked some time, The Rat sat and gnawed his nails. "Tomorrow afternoon," he broke out at last, "we'll watch and see if her carriage drives in for her. Then, when she comes to the door, I'll go in and begin to beg. The servant will think I'm a foreigner and don't know what I'm doing. You can come after me to tell me to come away, because you know better than I do that I shall be ordered out. She may be a good-natured woman and listen to us, and you might get near her." "We might try it," Marco answered. "It might work." "We will try it." The Rat never failed to treat him as his leader. He had begged Loristan to let him come with Marco as his servant, and his servant he had been more than willing to be. When Loristan had said he should be his aide-de-camp, he had felt his trust lifted to a military dignity, which uplifted him with it. As his aide-de-camp, he must serve him, watch him, obey his lightest wish, make everything easy for him. Sometimes Marco was troubled by the way in which he insisted on serving him, this queer, once dictatorial and cantankerous lad who had begun by throwing stones at him. "You must not wait on me," he said to him. "I must wait upon myself." The Rat rather flushed. "He told me he would let me come with you as your aide de camp," he said. It's part of the game. It makes things easier if we keep up the game." It would have attracted attention if they had spent too much time in the vicinity of the big house. So it happened that the next afternoon the great lady evidently drove out at an hour when they were not watching for her. They were on their way to try if they could carry out their plan, when, as they walked together along the Rue Royale, the Rat suddenly touched Marco's elbow. "The carriage stands before the shop with lace in the windows," he whispered hurriedly. Marco saw and recognized it at once. The owner had evidently gone into the shop to buy something. This was a better chance than they had hoped for, and when they approached the carriage itself, they saw that there was another point in their favor. Inside were no less than 3 beautiful little Pekingese spaniels that looked exactly alike. They were all trying to look out of the window and were pushing against each other. They were so perfect and so pretty that few people passed by without looking at them. What better excuse could 2 boys have for lingering about a place? They stopped and, standing a little distance away, began to look at and discuss them and laugh at their excited little antics. Through the shop window, Marco caught a glimpse of the great lady. "She does not look much interested. She won't stay long," he whispered, and added aloud, "That little one is the master. See how he pushes the others aside. He's stronger than the other 2, though he is so small." "He can snap, too," said The Rat. "She is coming now," warned Marco, and then laughed aloud, as if at the Pekingese, which, catching sight of their mistress at the shop door, began to leap and yelp for joy. Their mistress herself smiled, and was smiling as Marco drew near her. "May we look at them, Madame?" he said in French. And, as she made an amiable gesture of acquiescence and moved toward the carriage with him, he spoke a few words, very low but very distinctly, in Russian. "The lamp is lighted," he said. The Rat was looking at her keenly, but he did not see her face change at all. What he noticed most throughout their journey was that each person to whom they gave the sign had complete control over his or her countenance, if there were bystanders, and never betrayed by any change of expression that the words meant anything unusual. The great lady merely went on smiling and spoke only of the dogs, allowing Marco and himself to look at them through the window of the carriage as the footman opened the door for her to enter. "They are beautiful little creatures," Marco said, lifting his cap, and, as the footman turned away, he uttered his few Russian words once more and moved off without even glancing at the lady again. "That is one," he said to The Rat that night before they went to sleep, and with a match he burned the scraps of the sketch he had torn and put into his pocket. End of chapter 19. Chapter 20 of The Lost Prince. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Susan Umpleby. The Lost Prince by Francis Hodgson Burnett. Chapter 20. Marco Goes to the Opera. Their next journey was to Munich, but the night before they left Paris, an unexpected thing happened. To reach the narrow staircase which led to their bedroom, it was necessary to pass through the baker's shop itself. The baker's wife was a friendly woman who liked the 2 boy lodgers who were so quiet and gave no trouble. More than once she had given them a hot roll or so, or a freshly baked little tartlet with fruit in the center. When Marco came in this evening, she greeted him with a nod and handed him a small parcel as he passed through. "This was left for you this afternoon," she said. "I see you are making purchases for your journey. My man and I are very sorry you are going." "Thank you, Madame. We also are sorry," Marco answered, taking the parcel. "They are not large purchases, you see." But neither he nor The Rat had bought anything at all, though the ordinary looking little package was plainly addressed to him and bore the name of one of the big cheap shops. It felt as if it contained something soft. When he reached their bedroom, The Rat was gazing out of the window, watching every living thing which passed in the street below. He who had never seen anything but London was absorbed by the spell of Paris, and was learning it by heart. "Something has been sent to us. Look at this," said Marco. The Rat was at his side at once. "What is it? Where did it come from?" They opened the package and at first sight saw only several pairs of quite common woolen socks. As Marco took up the sock in the middle of the parcel, he felt that there was something inside it, something laid flat and carefully. He put his hand in and drew out a number of 5-franc notes, not new ones, because new ones would have betrayed themselves by crackling. These were old enough to be soft, but there were enough of them to amount to a substantial sum. It is in small notes because poor boys would have only small ones. "No one will be surprised when we change these," The Rat said. Each of them believed the package had been sent by the great lady, but it had been done so carefully that not the slightest clue was furnished. To The Rat, part of the deep excitement of the game was the working out of the plans and methods of each person concerned. He could not have slept without working out some scheme which might have been used in this case. It thrilled him to contemplate the difficulties the great lady might have found herself obligated to overcome. "Perhaps," he said, after thinking it over for some time, "she went to a big common shop, dressed as if she were an ordinary woman, and bought the socks, and pretended she was going to carry them home herself. She would do that so that she could take them into some corner and slip the money in. Then, as she wanted to have them sent from the shop, perhaps she bought some other things and asked the people to deliver the packages to different places. The socks were sent to us, and the other things to some one else. She would go to a shop where no one knew her, and no one would expect to see her, and she would wear clothes which looked neither rich nor too poor." He created the whole episode with all its details and explained them to Marco. It fascinated him for the entire evening, and he felt relieved after it and slept well. Even before they had left London, certain newspapers had swept out of existence the story of the descendant of the Lost Prince. This had been done by derision and light handling, by treating it as a romantic legend. At first The Rat had resented this bitterly, but one day at a meal, when he had been producing arguments to prove that the story must be a true one, Loristan somehow checked him by his own silence. "If there is such a man," he said after a pause, "it is well for him that his existence should not be believed in, for some time at least." The Rat came to a dead stop. He felt hot for a moment, and then felt cold. He saw a new idea all at once. He had been making a mistake in tactics. No more was said, but when they were alone afterwards, he poured himself forth to Marco. "I was a fool!" he cried out. "Why couldn't I see it for myself? Shall I tell you what I believe has been done? There is some one who has influence in England and who is a friend of Samavia. They've got the newspapers to make fun of the story so that it won't be believed. If it was believed, both the Yarovitch and the Maranovitch would be on the lookout, and the secret party would lose their chances. What a fool I was not to think of it! There's some one watching and working here who is a friend of Samavia." "But there is some one in Samavia who has begun to suspect that it might be true," Marco answered. "If there were not, I should not have been shut in the cellar. Some one thought my father knew something. The spies had orders to find out what it was." "Yes, yes, that's true, too," The Rat answered anxiously. "We shall have to be very careful." In the lining of the sleeve of Marco's coat, there was a slit into which he could slip any small thing he wished to conceal, and also wished to be able to reach without trouble. In this he had carried the sketch of the lady which he had torn up in Paris. When they walked in the streets of Munich the morning after their arrival, he carried still another sketch. It was the one picturing the genial-looking old aristocrat with the sly smile. One of the things they had learned about this one was that his chief characteristic was his passion for music. He was a patron of musicians, and he spent much time in Munich because he loved its musical atmosphere and the earnestness of its opera-goers. The military band plays in the Feldherrnhalle at midday. When something very good is being played, sometimes people stop their carriages so that they can listen. "We will go there," said Marco. "It's a chance," said the Rat. "We mustn't lose anything like a chance." The day was brilliant and sunny. The people passing through the streets looked comfortable and homely. The mixture of old streets and modern ones, of ancient corners and shops and houses of the day was picturesque and cheerful. The Rat swinging through the crowd on his crutches was full of interest and exhilaration. He had begun to grow, and the change in his face and expression, which had begun in London, had become more noticeable. He had been given his place, and a work to do which entitled him to hold it. No one could have suspected them of carrying a strange and vital secret with them as they strolled along together. They seemed only two ordinary boys who looked in at shop windows and talked over their contents, and who loitered with upturned faces in the Marienplatz before the ornate Gothic Rathaus to hear the 11 o'clock chimes play, and see the painted figures of the King and Queen watch from their balcony the passing before them of the automatic tournament procession with its trumpeters and tilting knights. When the show was over and the automatic cock broke forth in his lusty farewell crow, they laughed just as any other boys would have laughed. Sometimes it would have been easy for the Rat to forget that there was anything graver in the world than the new places and new wonders he was seeing, as if he were a wandering minstrel in a story. But in Samavia bloody battles were being fought, and bloody plans were being wrought out, and in anguished anxiety the secret party and the forgers of the sword waited breathlessly for the sign for which they had waited so long. And inside the lining of Marco's coat was hidden the sketched face, as the two unnoticed lads made their way to the Feldherrnhalle to hear the band play and see who might chance to be among the audience. Because the day was sunny, and also because the band was playing a specially fine program, the crowd in the square was larger than usual. Several vehicles had stopped, and among them were one or two which were not merely hired cabs, but were the carriages of private persons. One of them had evidently arrived early, as it was drawn up in a good position when the boys reached the corner. It was a big, open carriage, and a grand one, luxuriously upholstered in green. The footman and coachman wore green and silver liveries, and seemed to know that people were looking at them and their master. He was a stout, genial-looking old aristocrat with a sly smile, though as he listened to the music, it almost forgot to be sly. In the carriage with him were a young officer and a little boy, and they also listened attentively. Standing near the carriage door were several people who were plainly friends or acquaintances, as they occasionally spoke to him. Marco touched the Rat's coat sleeve as the two boys approached. "It would not be easy to get near him," he said. "Let us go and stand as close to the carriage as we can get without pushing. Perhaps we may hear some one say something about where he is going after the music is over." Yes, there was no mistaking him. He was the right man. Each of them knew by heart the creases of his stout face and the sweep of his gray mustache. But there was nothing noticeable in a boy looking for a moment at a piece of paper, and Marco sauntered a few steps to a bit of space left bare by the crowd and took a last look at his sketch. His rule was to make sure at the final moment. The music was very good, and the group about the carriage was evidently enthusiastic. There was talk and praise and comment, and the old aristocrat nodded his head repeatedly in applause. "The Chancellor is music mad," a looker on near the boys said to another. At the opera every night unless serious affairs keep him away. There you may see him nodding his old head and bursting his gloves with applauding when a good thing is done. He ought to have led an orchestra or played a cello. He is too big for first violin." There was a group about the carriage to the last, when the music came to an end and it drove away. There had been no possible opportunity of passing close to it even had the presence of the young officer and the boy not presented an insurmountable obstacle. Marco and The Rat went on their way and passed by the Hoftheater and read the bills. Tristan and Isolde was to be presented at night, and a great singer would sing Isolde. "He will go to hear that," both boys said at once. "He will be sure to go." It was decided between them that Marco should go on his quest alone when night came. One boy who hung around the entrance of the opera would be observed less than two. "People notice crutches more than they notice legs," The Rat said. "I'd better keep out of the way unless you need me. My time hasn't come yet. Even if it doesn't come at all, I've been on duty. I've gone with you and I've been ready. That's what an aide de camp does." He stayed at home and read such English papers as he could lay hands on, and he drew plans and refought battles on paper. Marco went to the opera. Even if he had not known his way to the square near the place where the Hoftheater stood, he could easily have found it by following the groups of people in the streets, who all seemed walking in one direction. There were students in their odd caps walking 3 or 4 abreast. There were young couples and older ones, and here and there whole families. There were soldiers of all ages, officers and privates, and when talk was to be heard in passing, it was always talk about music. For some time Marco waited in the square and watched the carriages roll up and pass under the huge pillared portico to deposit their contents at the entrance and at once drive away in orderly sequence. He must make sure that the grand carriage with the green and silver liveries rolled up with the rest. If it came, he would buy a cheap ticket and go inside. It was rather late when it arrived. People in Munich are not late for the opera if it can be helped, and the coachman drove up hurriedly. The green and silver footman leaped to the ground and opened the carriage door almost before it stopped. The Chancellor got out looking less genial than usual because he was afraid that he might lose some of the overture. A rosy-cheeked girl in a white frock was with him, and she was evidently trying to soothe him. "I do not think we are really late, Father," she said. "Don't feel cross, dear. It will spoil the music for you." This was not a time in which a man's attention could be attracted quietly. Marco ran to get the ticket which would give him a place among the rows of young soldiers, artists, male and female students, and musicians who were willing to stand 4 or 5 deep throughout the performance of even the longest opera. He knew that, unless they were in one of the few boxes which belonged only to the court, the Chancellor and his rosy-cheeked daughter would be in the best seats in the front curve of the balcony, which were the most desirable in the house. He soon saw them. They had secured the central places directly below the large royal box, where 2 quiet princesses and their attendants were already seated. When he found he was not too late to hear the overture, the Chancellor's face became more genial than ever. He settled himself down to an evening of enjoyment and evidently forgot everything else in the world. Marco did not lose sight of him. When the audience went out between acts to promenade in the corridors, he might go also, and there might be a chance to pass near to him in the crowd. He watched him closely. Sometimes his fine old face saddened at the beautiful woe of the music. Sometimes it looked enraptured, and it was always evident that every note reached his soul. The pretty daughter who sat beside him was attentive, but not so enthralled. After the first act, 2 glittering young officers appeared and made elegant and low bows, drawing their heels together as they kissed her hand. They looked sorry when they were obliged to return to their seats again. After the second act, the Chancellor sat for a few minutes, as if he were in a dream. The people in the seats near him began to rise from their seats and file out into the corridors. The young officers were to be seen rising also. The rosy daughter leaned forward and touched her father's arm gently. She wants him to take her out, Marco thought. He will take her because he is good-natured. He saw him recall himself from his dream with a smile, and then he rose and, after helping to arrange a silvery blue scarf round the girl's shoulders, gave her his arm, just as Marco skipped out of his fourth row standing place. It was a rather warm night and the corridors were full. By the time Marco had reached the balcony floor, the pair had issued from the little door and were temporarily lost in the moving numbers. Marco quietly made his way among the crowd, trying to look as if he belonged to somebody. Once or twice his strong body and his dense black eyes and lashes made people glance at him. But he was not the only boy who had been brought to the opera, so he felt safe enough to stop at the foot of the stairs and watch those who went up and those who passed by. Such a miscellaneous crowd as it was made up of, good unfashionable music lovers mixed here and there with grand people of the court and the gay world. Suddenly he heard a low laugh, and a moment later a hand lightly touched him. "You did get out, then?" a soft voice said. When he turned, he felt his muscles stiffen. He ceased to slouch and did not smile as he looked at the speaker. What he felt was a wave of fierce and haughty anger. It swept over him before he had time to control it. A lovely person who seemed swathed in several shades of soft violet drapery was smiling at him with long, lovely eyes. It was the woman who had trapped him into number 10 Brandon Terrace. End of chapter 20.